Blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is on the law of the Lord, and on his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. Welcome to the Bread of the Word podcast, a podcast striving to feast on God's Word and let the Bible speak to us all. Let us, as a former generation said, go ad fontes to the fountain and be nourished and sustained by all that God is. Let's dig in together. Hello and welcome back to the Bread of the Word podcast, where we go ad fontes to the fountain, to the Word of God, to be nourished and sustained by all that God is, as He's revealed Himself to us. My name is Tyler, and we are continuing to march verse by verse through the book of Job. Coming to verse 8. I'll be reading through to verse 12. These are the words of God. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he hath gained, when God taketh away his soul? Will God hear his cry when trouble cometh upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? I will teach you by the hand of God. That which is with the Almighty will I not conceal. Behold, all ye yourselves have seen it. Why then are ye thus altogether vain? And we have been working through some statements of Job as he returns an address from Bildad. As he returns some statements from Bildad about God's holiness and Job's implied unholiness. And Job said last week that God is not his enemy. That's where we left off, was that God is not my enemy. Let my enemy be the wicked. That my enemy be God's enemies, essentially. But here he says, what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he hath gained when God taketh away his soul? And many of us who grew up in the church may be familiar with a verse in Luke that says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? And I believe that is a reference to this. I believe that Jesus is quoting Job when he says that, and that this is something that harkens back to the book of Job. But the idea here being is that there are people that don't have this. There are people that do not have hope in God. That God is very much an enemy to them. And what are the sort of people what do they do? Is the question that Job is asking. He says, will God hear his cry when trouble cometh upon him? Will he, the wicked people, the hypocrites, will they delight in God? Will they always call upon God? Will God hear their cry when trouble comes upon them? And this is something that is difficult to articulate, I'll be honest. Because I've heard this abused. I've heard this idea twisted and contorted to be something that's not. And I've heard people say that God doesn't hear sinners. And if that is the case, I'm in trouble. Though I profess Christ, I am by definition a sinner. And so if we make a blanket statement that God does not hear the prayer of sinners, we got issues. But the context here, the greater scope of what's going on here, is not so much that God doesn't hear because they're sinners, as much as it is that there's not a relationship component here. Because oftentimes we've seen that God begins the dialogue. He doesn't respond, but he begins it. Who can believe that they have not heard? This is Paul in Romans. Likewise, we have all these passages in the Old Testament that talk about being silent before God, about listening to God. And I believe what is implied here is that the relational content of walking with God begins by listening, not by speaking. That is the picture that Job is painting here. It's not so much that God doesn't hear sinners because they're sinners, as much as my sheep hear my voice. That God speaks first and we listen. And that the relationship starts with God. And so the God doesn't hear them because he doesn't know them. There's not a back and forth. They don't hear his voice. They're not listening for him. And so there's a relational deficit when the hypocrites cry out to God. If we look over at Psalm 29, this is a passage that my pastor preached last Sunday. It says, "The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thundereth. The Lord is upon many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars. Yea, the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon." So we've got this picture here of the voice of the Lord, that it thunders, it is powerful, it is intense, it is strong, it is noticeable. It says, "He maketh them also to skip like a calf. Lebanon and Sidon, Syrian, like a young unicorn," as the King James says, or others might say something else. "The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness. The Lord shaketh the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord maketh the hinds to calve. The voice of the Lord causes smaller things, like the birth of a child." So it's not all thunder, it's not all extravagance, but there's something smaller, something we can know. And the overarching call of Psalm 29 is, listen to the God who is both. Listen to his voice. This goes throughout the Old Testament, this idea that we have to listen to God. That go back to Genesis 3, when God is dishing out punishments after Adam and Eve eat the fruit. He says to Adam, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, because you have listened to a voice other than mine." And then we get to Deuteronomy, and there's that famous phrase in Deuteronomy 6, "Hear Israel, listen Israel." And then he feeds them. And so in Genesis, Adam and Eve do not listen and eat, but in Deuteronomy, they listen and are fed by God. And so part of the unveiling of himself that God is enacting through the Old Testament is this idea of listening. And I go on that tangent because it's relevant here, because Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar has spent a lot of time speaking for God, speaking on behalf of God, speaking authoritatively, my mistake, about God. This is what God would do. This is what God would be like. This is. And they spend a lot more time talking about God and speaking on behalf of God than they seem to spend listening to God. Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. The wisest thing that these three did in this entire book thus far has been when they sat down in silence with Job for 7 days. When they sat down beside him and said nothing. Because once they started talking, it all goes downhill. Because they show themselves to be men without wisdom. Men with knowledge, but not wisdom. They know a lot of stuff. They know a lot of things that are objectively true, but they're not relevant here. They don't have knowledge that they're sharing, at least, that is useful. And that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom, is wisdom is useful. Wisdom is relevant. And so they spend a lot of time speaking for God, but I don't think they spend as much time listening to God, listening for the voice of God that shakes the cedars and causes the deer to give birth. And this, Job says, these are the people that are the hypocrite, that God taketh away their soul. These are the people that do not delight themselves in the Almighty, that God does not hear them when troubles come, because they have not been listening to God when things were going well. When the troubles arise, they cry out to God without having that ongoing relational depth with God. And so God, in some sense, doesn't hear. Not so much that he is unaware, but it's that he withholds that experience. He withholds that. And they don't delight themselves in God, in the Almighty, as it says in Hebrew. That's El Shaddai, that is the overpower. They don't delight themselves in the God who is powerful, in the God who is more powerful than they. That is not a delight to these people that Job is describing. And I think it is safe to say that the people he's describing are the people he's been talking with this entire book. That this is a picture of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, as they are hypocrites. He's called them counselors of no value. He's called them all kinds of things throughout this book. And to say that they're hypocrites at this point, it tracks. To say that they do not listen for God tracks. To say that they do not delight themselves in the might of God seems to track. And so will they, the hypocrites, delight themselves in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? And the answer would be no. Psalm 37 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And that's another phrase that has been abused and twisted into something, made to be something it's not, is this idea that if you delight yourself in God, he'll give you what you want. But the reality is, if we delight ourselves in God, if God is our delight, he gives us what we delight in, which is him. If we delight ourselves in God, he gives us more of himself. That is the picture in the Psalms. So we delight in God. There is none in heaven that I desire besides thee. But the hypocrite does not have that. He does not delight in God. He doesn't delight in the might of God. That is not a delight to him. That is something to be celebrated and to be enjoyed. That God is powerful. Because to the hypocrite, God is something to be manipulated. God is a thing to be profited from. God is something to be extorted when it's convenient. And that has been the testimony of these three friends, is that the only reason God would be punishing Job, would be dishing out suffering, would be if Job sinned. The only reason that Job would be suffering is if he was in a wrong standing with God. And ultimately, in their analysis, God could only do what he's doing if Job was in the wrong. And that is, as we've said, this is not wisdom. This is not true, because we have access to Job 1 and 2 that lays out that this is for a design that Job doesn't know. There's a reason for this, and rather than trying to rest in the fact that God is wiser than they have tried to prove themselves wiser than Job. That this is your problem. This is what you need to do. Here's your 12-step program to get back on the right track, rather than sitting there in silence with him to meet with God. They've not been listening for God. They've been speaking on behalf of God without all the facts. And these sorts of people, Job says, what hope do they have? Because they don't delight in God. They don't listen to his voice. But he says, I will teach you by the hand of God. That which is with the Almighty will I not conceal. That which is with El Shaddai I will not conceal. I will let God be God. Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the secret things belongeth to the Lord our God, but that which hath been revealed belongeth to us and to our children. For what purpose? So that we may do things in this law. That there is value to what God has made known. And so let it be known, is essentially what Job is saying. Let the things that are true of God, that he has revealed to me, be available to you. Let me share what God has taught me with you. That is Job's mindset here. He says that he will do this by the hand of God. That he will teach from the hand of God. That it is God who enables him to teach, to share, to speak. And that's only possible because Job has listened, because Job has walked with God. It says in the book of Acts that of the disciples, that though people did not believe what they were preaching, it says that they noted that they had been with Jesus. And the case seems to be true here with Job, that this is a man who has been with God, who has walked with God. And though he has suffered, and though he is continuing to suffer, Job seems to recognize that to speak of what is in God requires him to be imbued with the power of God, with the Spirit of God. That is the whole concept of this chapter right now, is that Job has the Spirit of God within him. God is within Job, and he recognizes that. It says, by this I will teach. That which is with God I will not hide, I will not conceal. In verse 12, behold, all ye yourselves have seen it. You have seen these things that are true of God, because they are out there. They are not hidden. And it says, why then are ye thus altogether vain? And that word in the Hebrew is hevel. And I point that out because that is a key word in the book of Ecclesiastes. Oftentimes we read that as vanity or meaninglessness or something like that. This idea of emptiness. To be painfully literal with Hebrew, it's vapor, it's wind. That's the word. You are altogether wind. You can't hold it, you can't count it, you can't measure it. It's wind. It's unattainable. And that is what you are, says Job. That is what you three are. You are useless counselors, you are vain people, you are hypocrites. Claiming to be wise, ye have shown yourselves to be fools. This is the parallel between Job and these three. Is that they claim to speak for God, but Job hasn't, thus far, has tried to listen for God. And he's going to say some pretty bold things as we continue through the book, and God is going to sort out some business. But at the end of the day, Job desires to walk with God. Job desires to let God be God, let Job be Job, and to sit at his feet. It says, as in one of the prophets, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. There is a place for being silent before God. And Job acknowledges that. And these three have not. They've done a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. And that speaks magnitudes to how we relate to God. How much time do we spend talking for God, and how much time do we spend listening for God, getting alone with God, being silent and letting God speak? How much of that time do we have? Do we use? Because it doesn't say in John 10 that my sheep preach my words. It says my sheep hear my voice. Are we the sheep that hear his voice? One, are we sheep? Are we the sheep of God? And two, are we listening for his voice? Are we getting acquainted with his voice? Because when we get acquainted with the voice, we don't say dumb things like what Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar have said that have no bearing on the present situation. When we know what truth sounds like, that changes things. And so ultimately, the picture that Job paints is that they are hypocrites. Claiming to be wise, they become fools. This is a picture of his counselors, of his accusers, of his satans. We went from having Satan the accuser at the beginning of this book to adding three others, to adding multiple accusers. And he has had multiple people accusing him of various things that are not true. And they have shown themselves to be every bit as unwise in this story as the devil himself. They have not shown themselves to be friends. Proverbs 17:17 says that a friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. But Job is not the better off in this adversity because they're here. He does not have wise counsel. The only one that he has is God. His friends are of no benefit. The only character in this story that is in Job's corner, that is working for his good, that is to his benefit, is God. And so Job endeavors to listen for his voice. May we be people who listen for his voice. May that be the cry of our hearts, to hear his voice. Maybe not audibly, maybe not with our ears, but to know what God desires of us. Do you long to have that question answered? What do you desire of me? What do you want me to be, God? To ask of God. To ask of God. To know God. Not just to know of God, but to know him. To hear his voice. To walk in his ways. Jeremiah 6 says, "Ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in them, and ye shall find rest for your souls." And I leave you once again with the words of Jesus. "Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon thee, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly at heart, and ye shall find rest for your souls." Thank you for listening. This has been the Bread of the Word podcast. Bread of the Word is a podcast ministry striving to feed people the wonderful words of God, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse, striving to let the Word speak for itself. This ministry is also a member of the Truth and Love Network, a diverse fellowship of fellow podcasts of different theological backgrounds, united in the gospel of God. For more from the Bread of the Word podcast or the Truth and Love Network, check out the links below and follow us on social media. Until next time, God bless. Matthew 4:4.